Welcome to the most important thing, the show where we break down one key analytical metric or statistic for fantasy football in under 20 minutes. I'm Jay, and today we're diving into yards per team play with our guest Marvin Elequin with the Fantasy Footballers. We're going to talk about what it is, where it came from, how to calculate it, how to use it, and why it matters. Let's go. Hey, welcome everyone. This is episode 2 here that we're doing, and today we're talking about yards per team play with Marvin. You can find Marvin on X at the FF_Marvin E. Marvin does incredible work out there. I see him all the time on X. Right now, it's draft season, and he's got prospect models for each of the positions. Running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, all out there. So go check those out. He also does prospect profiles on the Fantasy Footballers that you can see every season. During the season for the Footballers, he's doing weekly Dynasty reports and weekly expected points and opportunity reports. I find those incredibly useful from a week-to-week basis. And then during the off season, some of my favorite stuff comes out, the regression candidates that we're seeing, and then also the life cycle series. So for me, that stuff is really, really fascinating. The regression stuff, the life cycle stuff. The life cycle stuff is, these different positions, these different players, at what ages do they produce their peak amount of fantasy points, and when does that start to tail off? That kind of stuff is really fascinating to me. So thank you so much for joining us here, Marvin. How are you doing today?
Doing really well. Thanks for that great intro there. I appreciate it. I'm excited to be here. This is such a fun series, and I'm pumped to just contribute and talk about one of my favorite metrics for Dynasty football.
Yeah. So let's get into it. The metric stat that we're talking about today is yards per team play. You'll see that abbreviated as YPTP. Sometimes you put a T in front of it, so total yards per team play there. And the formula is fairly simple. We're talking about running backs here, so it's total scrimmage yards. So that's rushing yards and receiving yards divided by total team plays. So Marvin, what is yards per team play? Where did it come from? How have you seen it evolve over the years? And who are some of the first people that you saw using it? Where did you learn about it? How did you see it out there?
Yeah, it's exactly like you just mentioned. It takes into account a running back's entire production, and then it accounts for the team ecosystem, right? Because you think about some of the dynamic offenses. You think about Alabama, Ohio State. Those players will naturally produce more yards because they're in a better offense. But running backs or prospects that are in more inferior offenses can still be dominant. They can still be the focal point of an offense, even though the raw stats don't show it. So this metric really accounts for all of that. It just gives us a better overview of a prospect, right? It factors in receiving work too, which is super important, especially in a league now that prioritizes running backs that can be available on third downs and receiving work and screens and all of that. You want to see that highlighted, and this metric shows that both in total production, but then also in efficiency. So I like that it combines both, right? It's not just, hey, you're getting a bunch of carries and touches, so you have a bunch of yards, but you're also efficient with it, and then that does show up in this metric. As far as how it evolved in the community, I think this was kind of an offshoot of receiving yards per team pass done, which I know you guys talked about with Peter Howard just very recently. So it's very similar to that, but just factors in the receiving work, like I mentioned. And so there are different variations of it that have evolved throughout the years. I know the Campus to Canton team. So Jarek Backus is one that has popularized, I think it's experience adjusted production, also age adjusted. I think that takes it to another level and makes it a little more predictive than just the absolute total. But as a whole, that metric, just the metric alone is already very predictive, and one of the most non-advanced metric, I should say, that's very predictive. I think there's metrics out there like missed tackles forced, right? I think that's a big one out there. Those are a little harder to get to because they're behind a paywall, but this is one you can calculate all by yourself. And it's very predictive for running back. So that's why I love it. I know Peter Howard has used it quite a bit as well. And because it's a variation of the metric you guys talked about just recently. And so I'm a big fan of it. And it's one of the more simpler ones to calculate, but it tells a pretty big story, an important story for each prospect coming in.
Yeah, you hit on some really cool key guys. We had Peter on last week talking about reception yards for team pass attempt. Yeah, and Jarek over at Campus Can. Awesome examples of people out there to grab data from and get your
Mhm,
data sources to.
mhm,
So let's dive into sort of how to calculate it real quick. So this is just an example with really round numbers. Say you have a running backs for North Carolina this year, and he rushed for 1,600 rush yards and about 200 receiving yards for this season. And UNC's total team plays that this season were, hypothetically 900 plays. So the way that sort of you put this together would be the 1,600 rush yards plus the 200 receiving yards divided by, so you have 1,800 there, divided by the 900 team plays to get two yards per team play. So the other thing you can think about here is you can also games adjusted. We talked about this a little bit. Sometimes you have a player that goes out for a couple games, can't play a couple games. So how do you account for this games where there's all the on the team plays? You aren't games adjusted there, but the player is. So the way that you would do that, say a player plays 10 games of the team's total 13 games, you'd put it all in a per games basis. So 1,600 divided by 10, 200 divided by 10. So you get the players receiving yards per game and rushing yards per game. And then you have to do that also for the team plays. So, 900 team plays over 13 games, you get a team's play per game. And that's the way you can kind of games adjust it. It does, sort of account for those situations where players, but the risk that you get into there is that, you know, if a player hasn't played enough games, maybe then the statistic or metric doesn't become valid. So, we talked about last week about 8 games is kind of where it is. It might be a little bit less or more than that, but you just want to be careful with that. So Marvin, can you talk about some of the other derivations of this or games adjusted or anything like that? Or where do you find the stats? How do you come up with where these stats are? I mean, clearly rush yards and receiving yards you can find out there on ESPN or any site that you're looking for stats, but where do you find team plays or how do you get that data to calculate this?
Yeah, so Pro Football Reference has a college website, College Football Reference, I think is what they call it. Yeah, sports reference essentially. So the college football version of it, you can find team plays there fairly quickly. If you just find the player, you can find their raw stats, and then you can also just click on the team, and it'll show you for that year that's how many plays they had. And it's fairly simple, where you just find their passing plays, their running plays, and then you combine them, and you can use that. I think that gets you as close as you can. I like the example you put up there, because if you're looking at total numbers and the actual plays, you can potentially, if you can isolate it to only the games that they played, I think that tells you the more I guess detailed story, right? Because it shows like, hey, they were actually in the lineup in these games. How did the team perform with them? I think you already outlined a little bit of some things that could happen where they might change how they play slightly if they're not in the lineup, and so that could impact then their total plays number. So if you change it to a per game basis, that gets you super close. But I would recommend. I think Jarek actually does this. So if you highly recommend. Can't uh, push their work enough. Peter and Jarek have two databases that are super helpful. I know Jarek, I'm pretty sure, looks at it with just the games that they played, which that gets you to the number I mentioned. So if you find him on Twitter, find him on X, use his database. Same with Peter. That's maybe the fastest way to do it. But like I said, you can go into college football reference. You can just pull up the players, and everything's in there, which is why I love this metric so much, is that anyone can calculate it and get an idea of how productive a player was.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So that's great. And then here we're going to talk about how to use it. So you threw out a couple of things earlier, the age adjusted thresholds
Mhm.
versus experience adjusted thresholds. And I think we're also going to talk about absolute here. But really, how would you characterize the best way to use it? And then can you kind of describe the difference as you see it between experience and age adjusted thresholds?
Yeah, so age adjusted or even experience adjusted, in my opinion, are the best ways to look at it. And all it does is it takes a look, and the way at least I do in my database is I look at the running backs that have succeeded in the NFL. So in my eyes, that's a top 24 season in points per game. You could also look at it as a top 12 season for running back in points per game. But top 24 is just the baseline. And then how did they produce in college at each of the ages you're looking at or the years we're looking at, right? So I'll back up a little bit. So experience adjusted looks at their year since high school. So year one since high school, how do the successful NFL running backs produce? How did they produce in year two? And then in age adjusted, it's at age 18, 19, 20, and so on. And that becomes your baseline because those are the best running backs we've seen in the NFL. That's how they produce in each of those buckets. And then how does a prospect like Ashton Genty compare to that? Is he above those thresholds? Is he below? And then that gets you then almost like a variance of it. How do they compare to the best of the best? And so that gives you just another layer. The metric alone, like I mentioned, is really predictive already. But once you adjust it for age, once you adjust it for experience, it just takes it to that next step where it's a little more predictive than the absolute metric. So obviously with that you'd want a database. I go back to 2013. You can go back to 2015. Even just 5 years will tell you a lot already, as long as you have a solid set of prospects to compare it against. It can tell quite a bit. And I know we'll talk about absolute here, but even an absolute metric of is already helpful enough, right? Anything above two yards per team play is really, really good, and that tells you a lot about how productive they were, how elite a season was for that player.
Yeah, and I love that perspective. That's also the same way I look at it, experience adjusted there. I've always called it age, and I like the term
Mhm.
experience adjusted there as well. So you just have one, year two, year three out of high school. And
Mhm.
when you're looking at that, usually what happens is, your year one, the threshold for yards per team play for you to get above is much lower than year two and year three. So it's kind of like a threshold that rises and moves up to the right over time. So, when a player comes in from high school, we're looking at a market share here, right? So when a player comes in from high school, we want him to have a bit of the market share, but it doesn't need to be an elite level in his first year. But it kind of progresses where you get year two, year three, gets higher and higher, and the earlier the production comes, the better. So the higher and the earlier, the better. That correlates to success. So yeah, you mentioned absolute thresholds. These age-adjusted thresholds is kind of what I use, but absolute thresholds I think are also relative important as well because it acts as a really good screener. But
Mhm.
when you're looking at absolute thresholds, is there a particular number? You mentioned two. Are there numbers below that? Are you using the career average? Are you using the player's best year? Or are you using the final year? How are you thinking about when you're looking at absolute which numbers to use?
Yeah, yeah, love that question. So anything above one, I think to your point, uh, every year you expect them to produce a little more. I think once right at the gate, if they're true freshmen, if they exceed one, that's already pretty solid. I'd love to see that for a running back, but once they get older, especially sophomore and junior, that's usually the most predictive years. And if they dominate and exceed 2 yards per team play there, we see some of the best running backs hit that number. And you think about Jonathan Taylor's, Leonard Fournette, Christian McCaffrey, they all exceeded that threshold as sophomores and juniors, or once or twice even. Um, and that just tells you a lot. So that's why two is like the benchmark for me. And that's what I usually do throughout the season. So whenever I'm just looking at, okay, after the week's games, you want to find guys that produce that on a weekly basis, but even better on an average basis throughout the season. And for me, I think there's value in looking at the best year, the final year, but I found the higher hit rates and correlation with career averages. So I just look at how they did and for their entire career, because it just eliminates any variances, right? Like if something specifically happened for their best year, you want to also factor in some of the years where maybe things weren't working as well, right? Where they still may be efficient, but didn't get as many touches or vice versa, right? And so I think career average is my preference, and definitely per game is the way to go, in my opinion.
Yeah, I love that. So let's talk about a couple examples, or maybe if you have one, maybe you could talk about, how you see it used in the NFL, or,
Mhm.
how it's contributed to evaluating some of these past draft classes, or even this current draft class.
Yeah, I'd love to. I think this is such a fun class to talk about it too, because we have some really interesting running backs here, and there's been a lot of hype around that. But even just looking at historical, it's consistently, like I mentioned, it's improved hit rates if you just isolate it. I know we're going to talk about hit rates here in a second, but you look at some of the most productive players in experience adjusted yards per team play, and I'm just looking at day 1 and 2 prospects. I'll just list some of them out here. And I mean, you look
Sure.
at these names and they're elite, right? So Jonathan Taylor, even with day 2 capital, absolutely elite. He had a plus 0.92 career average on a per season basis. Leonard Fournette was plus 0.75. Christian McCaffrey's third. Dalvin Cook, Todd Gurley, Saquon Barkley is sixth on this list. Bijan, Duke Johnson. So, it tapers a little bit, but he had some good seasons. Gio Bernard, who I think was widely underrated. And then Brees Hall is up there as well. And so you look at that, right? And that's a pretty solid list. Now that's just the top, but it even if I look at day 3 guys, right? Aaron Jones was up on that list. He was third among day 3 guys. So that tells you if you isolate this metric, Aaron Jones would have stood out, right? As well as guys like Miles Gaskin, who had a solid season here. Jordan Howard is another one who had a couple of top 24 seasons. Devontae Booker, Chase Edmonds, Deuce Vaughn, who had a pretty solid experience adjusted production there. So I think if you isolate this with draft capital and you look at the top guys, you usually find a couple of hidden gems or guys that are just you can feel really confident in. Now, I don't know if we really needed confidence in guys like Jonathan Taylor or Christian McCaffrey, but it shows that it goes hand in hand. If you combine this metric with draft capital, you get a really good hit rate, which we'll talk about here. But I'll pause there, but I
Yeah,
think that kind of shows you just how good of a metric it can be because it does highlight the best of the best over the last several years.
Yeah, and do you notice when you're going through it, the calculation, what the results you get from? Are you notice any limitations in there? Are there things to watch out for that maybe flag false positives, like
Mhm.
guys who have really high yards per team play, but then actually don't end up being successful in the NFL? What are some of the things that the exceptions or things to watch out for when using this?
Yeah, I think there's uh the metric's not perfect by any means. It's not the correlation of it is not as high as draft capital. So definitely some false positives in there, some running backs that flag that aren't, and Deuce Vaughn might be one. I mentioned him. He's really high in this metric who likely won't. And I think that's where you factor in athleticism, size, because it does matter for the running back position. You factor in strength of schedule, which there are a couple ways to do that. I think every content creator does it slightly differently. Personally, I use the strength of schedule score from College Football Reference that helps account for it. So if you look at that for a player's college career, you can kind of get an average strength of schedule value there. But on the other end too, right? You guys that won't really flag highly in this metric are running back committees, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing, but if they were efficient, they can still be successful in the NFL. I think James Cook was one of those guys. He didn't really rank highly in this metric, but he was efficient in college, and so got the draft capital. So he's someone who you still would have invested in, but this metric, like I know for a fact, didn't like him at all as much. And then offensive line play isn't factored in here. I think about someone like Ollie Gordon who didn't have the best season this year, and offensive line had an impact in that, and that obviously then impacted his efficiency, his yards per team play after an outstanding sophomore season, right? So it's not a perfect metric by any means, but we do continuously see that guys that dominate in college that teams really rely on an offensive game plan usually tend to succeed in the NFL.
Yeah, that's perfect. The running back by committee example was maybe most pronounced maybe this
Hmm.
year with at
Yeah.
Ohio State in 2024 with Travion Henderson and Quinton Junkins really doing a complete split of most of the work in the backfield. So I
Hmm.
think there's maybe there's an exception, maybe there's reasons to think why this doesn't always work. And offensive line play is key for me We're not talking. It doesn't factor in how good the running back is. It's just straight, um, yards per team play. So if you have a really good offensive line, that may factor in a little bit of this metric. So let's get into the meat of this. Why does yards per team play matter? We talked a little bit. You've already shared a little bit about it being a little predictive, but can you talk a little bit about, do you think this is a descriptive or predictive type of metric or stat?
Mhm.
And then why should we prioritize this one over other metrics? And I know we're going to talk about hit rates here, and so I love this part of the discussion. But
Mhm.
yeah, why is this a better metric than others?
Yeah, so to me, it can be both descriptive and predictive, right? I think it's a good way to summarize how running backs have performed in the past. It tells you in the moment, like these are the most productive running backs, but it's very predictive. And when we look at future NFL production, because all it really does is it improves hit rates if you isolate it. And we'll show that here in a second. We'll talk about it. But even if you just look at straight up the correlation of it, so the R squared, if you look at how does it correlate to what I look at as points per game, and does it basically say like if yards per team play increases and how they're higher in that metric, how does it correlate to points per game in the NFL for fantasy football? And for context, draft capital for running backs, and this metric, this value will change depending on what database you're looking at, how far you go back, which running backs you're looking at. But I'm looking at all prospects since 2013, and the correlation for draft capital is 0.4. So that's a range from 0 to 1. So zero point 0.4 is actually the best metric we have. If you just looked at one thing, draft capital is the way to go, but it's best to combine it with other things. And I found that this metric has the highest correlation outside of any metric, higher than Ross yards per game, total scrimmage yards market share. This has the highest correlation at 0.22. When you adjust it for experience or age, even, it gets up to 0.25 roughly. And so compared to other metrics like total yards market share, dominator rating, yards per touch, which really doesn't have that high of a correlation, this is the best of the best, right? None of those exceed 0.2 that I mentioned, the metrics that I just mentioned. And so that's why if I had two metrics I could use, it would be draft capital for sure, but then this would be the second one because it does then isolate the best of the best and improves hit rates, which you guys can see right there on the screen too.
I love that. And what's the difference between the two columns? I see the experience adjusted total yards per team play of a plus zero point 0.5 on the right hand
Mhm.
side. So,
Yeah.
how does it, if you get that sort of elite sort of yards per team play, how is it bumping up this? How do you read this graph on the right hand side versus the left hand side?
Yeah, great question. So, we talked a little bit about how you set that baseline, right? The
Yeah.
best running backs, the top 24 running backs that produce that kind of production, that becomes the baseline. So, anything on the left side, all I'm doing is I'm looking at running backs on a career basis that have exceeded that baseline at the very least. So they're above average compared to the best running backs in the NFL currently, and so anything above zero is means you exceed it. So that's what the left side shows, and you'll see like the total hit rates in both sections are the same, right? So uh, day one running backs, they almost always hit at 85%. Day two running backs, that first column, 58% hit rate. And then day three running backs, typically pretty low at 13, 14%. But even if you just look at the guys that are above average in this metric and exceed that zero, right? You just don't
Yeah.
want it to be negative. You see the hit rates already improve a little bit. But the reason, so for me, I look at guys that aren't just above average, but are truly elite. And 0.5, I found is kind of like a nice round number. Again, it's arbitrary too, because you could, like, if they're just 0.49, doesn't mean they're terrible, right? But 0.5, I'm seeing like there's a pretty sizable increase from there. And so when you look at the right side of the chart, total hit rates are the same as the one on the left, but once you adjust for experience adjusted that exceeded 0.5, you get to 100% hit rate for day one running back. So those are the guys you feel 100% confident in. Spoiler, Ashton Genty is part of that. And then day two guys, this is, in my opinion, the biggest jump, right? Going from 58% to to 89%. That almost, it's not 100%, but it's pretty darn close. That tells you if you isolate day two running backs where we've seen some misses here and there, where on average it's roughly 50-50. If you just use this metric to isolate that, you get to a pretty good hit rate of running backs that have succeeded in the NFL. So I think using this threshold for day two running backs, in my opinion, is the most important. And then for day three, again, you're betting on guys that probably won't hit. But if you had to, I'd rather bet on a guy that has an 18% hit rate versus 13-14%. So not massive increase, but those are the guys where I mentioned, like Aaron Jones would fall in that category, Marlon Mack, and some of those running backs that have succeeded even as day three prospects.
Oh, this is perfect. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. This is exactly perfect. So we're gonna wrap things up here, but too long didn't read. If there's one thing you want everybody to sort of take away from this discussion about yards per team play, what would that be?
Yeah, I think that the best predictor for NFL production, as I mentioned, is past success, right? It's draft capital, but also past success. And so to me, the one thing to take away is that production matters. That's why we target running backs who dominate in college, that were highly efficient. And I think it also shows that we shouldn't shy away from running backs that had a lot of touches in college, because a lot of times if they can carry the workload and are efficient and rank highly in this metric, they'll do it again in the NFL. So production matters. Athleticism matters. All those metrics matter too. There's so many other metrics we need to factor in here, not just one. But honestly, if you just look at one thing, look at this metric, look at the guys that produced highly in college, and you'll find a pretty good group of running backs to invest in for Dynasty.
Awesome. Love it. Thank you so much, Marvin, for joining us. You can find Marvin and all of his work at FF_Marvin E on X, and I'm sure many other places as well. And you can find all of his work also on the fantasyfootballers.com. So thank you so much, Marvin, for joining us. And if you found this helpful, please like, comment, subscribe down below of the Devy Royale and the most important thing. See you next time on the most important thing.